And welcome, Dr. Glad Sunshine.
Thank you. For those of you who were here last night, I mentioned that my daughter wrote a version of A Visit from St. Nicholas. I actually tracked it down. So you are going to hear this, whether you like it or not. One word that you're going to need to know, the question that was really being debated was Jesus of the same substance as the Father? Arius said he was like the Father. Athanasius said he was the same substance as the Father. So for Arius, the Greek word is Jesus was homoousios, like substance. For Athanasius, it's homoousios, same substance. You need to know that. Okay, so here we go. 'Twas the night of the council, and all through Nicaea they argued about an important idea. The emperor nestled and dozed in his chair while words of theology danced through the air. Is Jesus divine, was the question at stake. They had all settled down for a heated debate. For Arius said, if there's only one God, can Christ be God also? That seems rather odd. And Arius stated that there was a time when Jesus was not. Now this was a crime in the eyes of St. Nicholas because he knew Jesus and God the Father were homoousios. The same in their substance, both without beginning. To say otherwise, St. Nick would call sinning. But Arius stubbornly wouldn't give way, no matter what Orthodox bishops might say. Then up from his seat, Nick sprang with a start, and he said to Arius, you're not so smart. His eyes, how they twinkled with fires of passion. He strode through the room in a most fearsome fashion. He moved like an arrow shot out of a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. Then there in the hall there arose such a slap that even the emperor awoke from his nap. The bishops all gasped and Arius whined, and Nick was arrested, but he didn't mind. For the council's conclusion expressed in the creed was what he defended in word and in deed. Soon the council was over, he had to go back and look for more heretics that he could smack. And they heard him exclaim as he rode out of sight, say the Christ isn't God and you're in for a fight. Like I said, my daughter is much more clever than I am. Okay, now, last night we covered an awful lot of ground, but I did do my decade a minute. It was really right about dead on there, maybe a little bit off. But the thing you need to remember if you've been here, and if you weren't, well, here's your review. All of the things that we talked about, all of the major themes that we talked about in the first 500 years or so of church history keep coming back to haunt us. We get the same objections, or many of them. Christians are arrogant for saying theirs is the only way to God. Gnosticism, church-state relations, Donatism, Pelagianism, even monasticism in various forms. All of these things are ongoing themes in church history. And in fact, the whole Arian controversy is going to come back in the modern world. So basically, if you understand the first 5 centuries, you've got the foundation for understanding almost everything that follows, with a few exceptions. Okay, so that's sort of your summary of some of the themes we talked about and why they're important. Now I get to the really impossible job, the medieval church. The Middle Ages covers a period of, actually, depending on how you date it, roughly 1,000 years. And we sometimes treat the Middle Ages as if it's just this sort of blank period where nothing happened. Well, actually, quite a lot happened. And I can't even begin to get into all the major themes that occurred during the Middle Ages. I'm going to limit myself to 2 or 3. So let's start off with climate change. Current issue. As the Roman Empire was declining in the first few centuries, the climate was shifting. It was getting colder and wetter. And what this meant is that your farmers, the growing season shortened. There are a lot of people around here are farmers, at least. The growing season shortened, especially in the north. People couldn't grow crops anymore. Their crops wouldn't ripen. Net result, they began to migrate south. They started pushing other people around, and the net result is that you get the so-called barbarian invasions, which really amounted, for the most part, at least initially, to people. Rome had for centuries been propagandizing the world, telling them about how wonderful it is, how stable Rome is, how strong Rome is. Now they're jostling each other, their fights, the Huns are moving in from Asia and all of that. What do? I know what we'll do. We need a better life economically. We need protection from violence. Let's go to Rome. And they begin migrating into Rome. Does this sound familiar? Okay, so what happens is the barbarian migrations occur primarily in the West. There's a little bit happening in the East, but we're not going to worry about that. And basically, because of a combination of that and incompetence in the government and the loss of virtue in Roman society, the Roman Empire in the West collapses. What we call the fall of Rome really means the Latin West stops being under Roman imperial authority. By this point, the center of the empire had already moved east. The Roman Empire continues very well, thank you very much, in the east until 1453. But we're focusing on Western Europe here because we can't do everything. Roman administration collapses. And with the collapse of Roman administration, Roman education collapses. The only people who are left standing that can actually try to hold things together are the bishops in the churches. The net result is the bishops begin taking on various kinds of responsibilities for administration to try to hold the Roman towns together while they're shrinking, disappearing, and all of that. The Franks, especially the tribe of the Franks, move in. They take over a good part of Western Europe. They convert to Christianity, at least nominally. And so you're left with a situation where you've got bishops who are doing administration along with the barbarian nobles, and generally the state of the culture and the church goes into a severe decline. This is the beginning of what British historians refer to as the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages isn't a term that refers to the entire Middle Ages. It's just this period of the early Middle Ages from, let's call it, roughly 500 to roughly 1000. And it's called the Dark Ages because they're not writing records. We can't see into it. We don't know what's going on. It's historically dark. As historians, we don't know a lot about what's really happening there. Okay, so that's the situation in Western Europe, with one exception. Ireland. Ireland was outside the boundaries of the Roman Empire. The Romans had considered invading Ireland and taking it over, but as they thought about it, their reaction was, why bother? There's nothing there that we want. It's just a bunch of very warlike people who are fighting each other all the time over sheep and cattle. I mean, what's to get out of this? But there was a Romano-Briton, a Romanized Briton in England who was actually kidnapped by Irish slave traders named Patrick. And Patrick was taken to the western part of Ireland. He was owned by a druid. He was put in charge of watching his sheep and such. And Patrick had grown up in a Christian home, but really didn't take it particularly seriously. But while he was in the backwater in Ireland, he started thinking, this is appropriate punishment from God for my sin. And he started praying and praying. He said he prayed up to 100 times a day. I think that means the Lord's Prayer, but I'm not sure. And eventually he got a vision that said, all right, it's time to go back home. So God told him in this vision to go across Ireland and a ship would be waiting for him. He walked across Ireland, an escaped slave. He went all the way across Ireland, made it to the coast, found a ship that eventually got him back home. He promised his family he would never leave. He wouldn't leave again. They were thrilled to find him. They thought they would never see him again. But then he had a dream in which someone in Ireland said to him, "Holy boy, come help us." And he believed that that was God's call for him to become a missionary to Ireland. He went to France, to a monastery at Les Reines, Marmoutier, a few others, became a priest, and then went back to Ireland to preach. Now, Ireland at this point, in order to understand what's going on here, you need to know a little bit about Irish religion, pagan Irish religion. You know, the Druids and all those guys? In order to become a Druid in ancient Ireland, it took something like 30 years of study, maybe 40. It was a very long, slow process, because in order to become a Druid, you had to master everything about the culture. You needed to know history, you needed to know legends, you needed to know mythology, you needed to know religion, you needed to know magic, you needed to know law, you needed to know music, poetry, on and on and on. You had to learn everything. You were the complete repository of culture. And they didn't write anything down. This was all done orally. So these guys were incredibly well-trained, well-educated, and so on. The other thing you need to know is that the Irish practiced human sacrifice. Their gods required human sacrifice of them at various points. Theoretically, being a sacrifice was considered an honor. I doubt many of the people who actually were sacrificed viewed it that way. But there you have it. So Patrick goes to Ireland. He knows all this. He was a slave under a Druid. He knows the language, he knows the culture. He arrives there, and at this one major festival, the High King of Ireland, who is in Tara, north of Dublin, you're supposed to light bonfires for this festival. No one in Ireland is to light a bonfire until the king lights his. So the king would light his on the hill of Tara, the surrounding hills would light theirs, that would cue the others to light theirs, and so on. Almost like that scene in The Lord of the Rings. Okay. Patrick comes and he goes to the Hill of Slane near Tara, and before the king lights his bonfire, he lights his. Totally disrupted the whole thing. The king's really annoyed, and he says, "Go find out who did that." They bring Patrick in, and Patrick preaches the gospel. One of the first people to convert was a man named Eric. Eric was a Druid. And Eric will actually found a monastery on the Hill of Slane where Patrick lit that bonfire. From there, Christianity is going to spread. Patrick is in danger of his life through this entire thing. But he's going to go around, he's going to preach, he is going to convert many of the nobles, many of their daughters especially, and many of the Druids. The Druids are among the first people that Patrick converts. And I can't prove this, but I strongly suspect that the reason why is that Patrick says to them, your gods demand you sacrifice your children for them. The true God gave up his son for you. Can't help but think that that's part of the message that takes off. Okay, so Christianity spreads across Ireland. Different form from what you see in the continent. I can't explain that, it gets complicated, but very much like the Desert Fathers, very ascetic in a lot of ways, but not always. It's complicated. But the key here is that if you convert to Christianity out of the pagan past that the Irish had, what does that tell you about what it means to be a holy man? Well, if you're going to be a holy man in the old religion, you need to know everything there is to know about everything. What that means is that if you're going to be a holy man in Christianity, you need to know everything there is to know about Christianity and the cultures that produced it. So the Irish, now this is complicated. Remember, the Irish don't have a written language. So you're in a situation where they need to learn Christianity, they need to learn culture, all of those kinds of things, in Latin, which they don't speak, or Greek, which they don't speak, or Hebrew, which they don't speak, and you've got to do it from written sources. And, just to make this a little more challenging, in this period, all three languages were written as an unbroken string of letters without word spacing, capitalization, or punctuation. Right. So what do the Irish do? They say, well, we want to learn this stuff. We can learn Latin. We can do that orally. There are people who can teach us that. But it's really hard to read this. Now, if I gave you an English text like this, you could read it. But that's because you're fluent in English and you're used to reading. They look at this and say, this is way too hard. So what they start doing is changing the way writing is done. They start introducing word breaks, rudimentary punctuation, and rudimentary capitalization. In other words, they start the way what you're used to reading starts with the Irish, because they've got to learn how to do this in a foreign language. In the process, they transform reading, which up to this point had been a secondary means of learning. Most learning was done orally. They transform it into a primary means of learning and basically invent the kind of reading you do today. And they master everything there is out there to master, everything they can get their hands on. In the early Middle Ages in Western Europe, if you ran into someone who knew Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, that person was Irish. It's as simple as that. Ireland became known as the island of saints and scholars. Now, this part of the history, for some reason, nobody ever talks about. I think it's really important. And there are some really incredibly colorful stories surrounding this, but I'll only do one of them for the sake of time. The Irish had a practice that they called peregrinatio, which is a Latin word meaning pilgrimage. Except in Ireland, what a pilgrimage was a typically unplanned wandering, going wherever God sent you, with the knowledge that you would most likely never return home. Basically, these were missionary journeys. But they, like I said, they would go, they were unplanned. They believed God would send them where he wanted them. In one case, there's an account that a boat landed in Wales with Irish monks in it. It had neither oars, nor sail, nor rudder. They had just gotten into the boat and said, God, send us where you want us. And they pushed off into the sea and ended up in Wales. I mean, there's some crazy stuff here. But one guy in particular I want to focus on. His name is Columbanus. Columbanus, as a young man, well, the story is apparently he was really good looking, and he had all kinds of girls who wanted to marry him. And, but he thought maybe he should become a monk, join the church. And he went to an old woman in his village, a wise old woman in the village, and he said to her, you know, it's sort of like poor, pitiful me. All these girls won't let me be. But I'm thinking maybe I should go into the monastery. And the woman said to him, you remember Samson, David, Solomon? Women are trouble. Go to the monastery. So he went to the monastery. And he spent years there. He became the head of the school there, incredibly well-educated guy. He becomes head of the school. And at about the age 40, he believed God was calling him to go on his peregrinatio. The abbot didn't want to let him go, so he waited a couple more years. He asked again, and the abbot released him. So he went out with 12 followers. 12, notice, he's following Jesus here. 12 followers in a boat, and they set sail. They landed in Carnac in Brittany, France, on the western side of France. They then began a preaching tour going west. Now, at this point, the church is really corrupt. The clergy, well, the clergy aren't really doing their job. There's very little education, all of this kind of thing. They've never seen anything like these guys. These guys are absolutely sold out to the faith. And they're causing a stir wherever they go. Eventually, they get to the kingdom of Burgundy in what's modern-day Western France. And the king there, the under-king, is a guy by the name of Gontram, and he gives them an old ruined Roman fortress at a place called Onegray to start a monastery. So they start a monastery there, and people flock to it. They're really attracted by the fact that these guys are serious about their faith and they are living their faith. It looks different from the way we live our faith today, but they were completely sold out to God. And this was attractive. So all kinds of people come to them. They are actually forced to start another monastery at a place called Luxeuil, and then there's a third as well. And it's just going great guns. But the problem is, Columbanus is doing this the way it's done in Ireland, not the way it's done on the continent. And the bishops are really upset because he's making them look bad. So they call a synod to meet together with Columbanus to straighten him out. Columbanus replies, "I got too much work to do for God. Maybe you guys should try it." He then sends a letter to the Pope, which is much more polite than the way I'm going to say it. But what it boils down to is, hey, these bishops you got here are a bunch of clowns. They're your responsibility. You need to straighten these guys out. He's writing to the Pope, giving him advice. Okay. Columbanus should have paid a little more attention to the story of John the Baptist, perhaps, because he began criticizing the immorality of the royal family. The queen mother at this time was a woman named Brunhilde. Now, if the name Brunhilde rings any bells to you, she's why. She is the one, like in the Nibelungenlied, in the Song of the Nibelungs in Wagner, Brunhilde, all of that, she's where this started. And she was an incredibly nasty person. She realized she couldn't just off these guys. So what she does is she says, okay, the monasteries can stay functioning, but all you Irish, you got to get in a boat and go back to Ireland. So they get in a boat, they put it out on the Rhine River, they start setting sail, and a storm comes up and the ship wrecks. The captain of the ship says, you guys are a bunch of Jonahs, get off my boat. So they get off the boat and they do what they do. They begin preaching. And this time they go down the Rhine River into Switzerland. They get to a lake in Switzerland where there's an old church that had been converted to a pagan shrine. They're unhappy about this, so they blow a trumpet or something. They gather all the people. They grab the idols in the church, take them out, throw them in the lake. And it turns out that one of Columbanus's guys actually knew the local language. These guys studied everything. So he preached to them, and they returned to Christianity. A church started there. But Columbanus got into a certain amount of trouble, once again, with the local authorities, and they told him he had to leave. His follower, a guy by the name of Gall, who started the church, stayed, and this becomes the origin of the canton in Switzerland known as St. Gallen, St. Gall. Meanwhile, across the Alps in Italy, northern Italy was under the control of the Lombards. They were people who were Arians. They didn't accept Jesus as God. But the king had a wife, Theodelinda, who was Orthodox, and she was trying to convince him, Guthlaf, to bring Orthodox Christianity in. They hear about Columbanus, they invite him to cross the Alps and start a monastery. So he starts a monastery at a place called Bobbio and dies there the following year. Okay, so that's Columbanus' story. Why is it important? When I was in grad school, I studied medieval paleography. That's the skill of learning to read ancient handwritings. So I was learning to read medieval handwriting. Not easy. One of the things we had to do, which I could do then, but I can't do now because I've forgotten all of this, is we had to date manuscripts to within 50 years of when they were written and tell where the scribe was trained on the basis of the handwriting. You could do this. No, there are people who can do this. Every manuscript we studied from the 9th century, 8th, 9th century, that era, well, 8th century, 9th century is different. Late 7th into 8th century, every manuscript we studied came from a monk trained either in a monastery founded by Columbanus or a daughter monastery of a monastery founded by Columbanus. Without him, we don't have records from this period at all. He's responsible for beginning, he and others are responsible for beginning the reintroduction of education into Europe. Now, the one point during the early Middle Ages where you have centralization of government and things like that is under Charlemagne. Charlemagne, when he builds his empire, realizes he needs educated people to run it. So what does he do? He says, all right, who's the best scholar in Europe? Answer, a guy up in York, a church founded by the Irish by the name of Alcuin, who apparently got his training in an Irish monastery. So Charlemagne brings Alcuin in. Alcuin introduces the liberal arts, which is an ancient Roman curriculum of studies. He reintroduces that into Europe. He also begins a process of standardizing and copying manuscripts. The oldest copies of most manuscripts that we have of ancient works, the oldest copies of the vast majority of them are made by Alcuin's copyists. Okay? In other words, without Alcuin, trained by the Irish, without Alcuin there coming in and doing this with Charlemagne, we don't have ancient literature. They preserve it. On top of that, he starts schools in monasteries, in cathedrals, and in the palace. He actually, Charlemagne and Alcuin and the other nobles would actually discuss theology, philosophy, and engage in debates as their evening entertainment. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have television. They didn't have movies. So what do? You talk. By the way, one thing that's frequently said about Charlemagne is that he was illiterate. Not true. Charlemagne could read very well, thank you very much. What he couldn't do was write. How can you read without writing, being able to write? Well, the answer is that it takes a lot of fine muscle control to operate a pen. And if you don't get that when you're young, you will never get it. So this is one of the things that drives me up the wall with advice about raising children. Don't have your children color in the lines. Let them be creative. Let them just scribble all over it. No. Coloring books are not an exercise in creativity. They're an exercise in fine muscle control. Coloring books are there to give you the basic skills to hold a pen and write later. Anyway, it's interesting. I was, at one point when I was in Paris doing my research, I was in a library and I got this folio, and it wasn't particularly indexed. It was just this big folder of documents. And I needed to go through this to see if there was anything that was relevant to what I was doing so that I could transcribe it or do whatever I needed to do with it. And as I was going through, I came across a document that I had only read about. I had the original in my hand. It was a decree from Charles IX of France after St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. You don't need to worry about that. But what was interesting is when you read it, the decree is written in a very small hand. Okay, very, very small letters. Charles's signature is this big. Why? Because the guy who was writing it was a professional scribe. Charles never had to spend a lot of time working. I mean, he did learn to write, but he didn't have to spend a lot of time to it. Didn't spend a lot of time on it, so he didn't have the fine muscle control to write small. He wrote in letters this big. The same kind of thing is going to continue anyway. That has nothing to do with the Middle Ages. All right, sorry. Let's get back to it. Okay, so Alcuin begins all of these schools, monastic schools, cathedral schools, and the palace school. The palace school falls apart within a generation or so after Charlemagne. The cathedral schools also start falling into disarray because after Charlemagne, within a generation or two, his empire collapses. It falls apart due to brothers going to war with each other over who runs it, who gets titles, and all of that. And Europe, you have this initial burst of scholarly activities, centralization, all of these kinds of things under Charlemagne. Then it falls apart, goes into a decline. The title of emperor disappears, and so on. By the way, during this period, the papacy also goes into a serious decline. As a matter of fact, there's a period that is referred to as the papal pornocracy, which it literally means government by prostitute. And there's a very specific reason for that. But it's a low ebb in papal history. Probably the best example of this is that one pope got upset with his predecessor, who had died, and he decided that he wanted to, try him for heresy. So he had the body dug up, dressed in the papal robes, seated in a chair, and put him on trial for heresy. And since he did not mount an effective defense, he was condemned, stripped of his papal robes, his body was thrown in the Tiber River. Now, the pope that did that, his successor thought this was a crock, fished the body back up and reinterred him properly. And in case you're wondering, I am not making this up. You can look it up. It's called the Cadaver Synod. It's a real thing. I mean, so this is the level at which the papacy is going. It's little more than a political football, kicked back and forth between Roman noble families. Around the 10th century, though, about the year 950 roughly, the king of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, which we would call Germany, manages to actually consolidate power. And he had claims down into Italy, so he moved into Italy, consolidated power there, deposed a couple of popes and appointed new ones. He was in favor of church reform. And then his successor, but he's known as Otto the Great, Otto the First. His successor, Otto the Second, did the same thing. His successor, Otto the Third, they're very creative with names. Otto the Third similarly is working with this. So, but with Otto the Great, he's able to consolidate enough power and build enough territory that they reinstitute the title of emperor. It had fallen into disuse. He's now named the Holy Roman Emperor. And technically the Holy Roman Emperor of the German people. So it's modern day Germany through Austria down into roughly the northern half of Italy, at least nominally, as well as some territories into modern day France. The borders are different then. With the imperial revival, when the emperor does this, like I said, he's deposing popes and appointing new ones, and the ones that they appoint tend to be very talented. They're very capable. But the popes begin saying, well, wait a minute, we don't really want the emperor to be the one who's appointing us. We want to get the papacy independent of the emperor. Remember the issue of church-state relations? Where is the boundary drawn? With Constantine, or with the precedent that the early church is independent of the state, it can function separate from the state. So we've got this idea of church-state separation. How do we make this work now? We've got the emperor who's completely dominating the church. So you get this papal reform that's going to happen, and eventually, after a number of wars, and I'm talking, well, it's not exactly shooting wars unless you're talking bows, but you know, kinetic wars. After a number of these, eventually it'll sort itself out that the Pope is actually an independent, has an independent territorial state in Italy. And the emperor's got his area and all of that. And they're constantly fighting back and forth between them, and ultimately the King of France is going to get involved too. There's this constant tug of war during the Middle Ages over who has greater power, who is really the top dog in Christendom. The Pope says, it's me. The emperor says, yeah, not so fast. Okay. This is the beginning of something known as the papal monarchy. The popes begin making increasingly grandiose claims about their authority. As the spiritual world is superior to the temporal world, as heaven is superior to earth, as eternity is superior to time, so the church is superior to the state and the pope is superior to the emperor. These kinds of arguments. They don't always work because the pope's armies aren't always up to the task of enforcing them. But this is going to be one of the things that is going to lead to a split with the Eastern Orthodox Church. What's going to happen there is, well, two things. First of all, one of the mistakes Alcuin made, the guy who's doing all these copying things, he wants to come up with a standardized version of the liturgy for the Mass, for the church services. And he picked as his master copy of the Nicene Creed one coming from Spain. And in Spain, Spain had been controlled for a while by the Visigoths, who were another Arian tribe. And the Orthodox Christians in Spain wanted to really drive home the point that Jesus is God. So they added a word to the Nicene Creed. Originally, the Nicene Creed said, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, who with the Father and the Son is worshipped and glorified. They added the word filioque, one word in Latin, three words in English, and the Son. The Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son is worshipped and glorified. So that became the standard form of the creed used in the Latin West. Well, as the Pope is beginning to make these claims of authority over the entire Christian world, claims, by the way, which are contradicted by the Council of Nicaea back in 325, he sends representatives to Constantinople to get them to submit to the authority of the Pope. The patriarch in Constantinople says, wait a minute, this isn't how this works. And they discuss this back and forth for a bit, and ultimately the papal representatives go into Hagia Sophia, the main church in Constantinople, this big, beautiful church. They walk in and they put a bull of excommunication against the patriarch on the high altar of Hagia Sophia on the grounds that he, first of all, rejects the authority of the Pope, which is an innovation on the part of Rome, and secondly, that he removed the filioque from the creed. They didn't know that they were the ones that added it. Well, the patriarch promptly responds by excommunicating them. And while they eventually more or less paper this over, that division remains to this day. Those are the core issues in terms of ideas, in terms of theology, that separate the Eastern and Western Church. There are historical things that also factor in, but that's where you get the division. What's important here is that when we read in our books about this, it's described as when the Eastern Orthodox Church broke away from Rome. In point of fact, it should be the other way around, because the Roman Catholic Church at this point is the one that's innovating. They are adding to a creed that was decided by an ecumenical council, and they're advancing claims for papal authority that even in 325 at the Council of Nicaea, if you simply read the minutes of Nicaea, which I've done, it contradicts it completely. The Pope didn't have universal jurisdiction. This is something they're innovating on. It's a claim they're making. So actually, the Orthodox have the right on this one. Okay. And like I said, I would argue that what really happens is that the Western churches break away from the East. Okay. Well, while all of this is going on, by the way, there's another climate shift at this point. Climate gets warmer and drier. We have this period from, call it around 400 to 900, where it's colder and wetter. Then it starts getting warmer and drier again. In fact, the medieval warm period was warmer than it is now, contrary to what you may hear on the news. How do I know that? The Vikings farmed in Greenland. They grew grapes in Norway. This was a warmer period. Climate changes, this is what happens. So it gets warmer, which means the growing season improves, which means it's easier to raise food, which means you get growing population, you get surplus population in the country, they move to the cities, you get urbanization, all of these kinds of things begin happening. And once you begin getting cities developing and more trade happening and all of that, you need educated people once more, and especially you need law. You need a new kind of law because the feudal law that worked well in the rural areas doesn't work for commercial life. So they say, well, where are we going to find how we should do this? They go back to ancient Roman law. Rome was a commercial society. So they go back to Roman law, they begin studying that, and the first place that education begins to revive in Europe is in law schools. This has an important effect in a number of ways. The cathedral schools, by the way, are revived. The cathedrals begin teaching again because there's a growing demand for education. One of the effects that this has is that theologians in this period, like, for example, Anselm of Canterbury, Anselm is going to be influenced by the fact that legal studies are the big cutting edge in education now. And he starts looking at theology and applying legal ideas to theology. And so I referenced this last night. Anselm is going to begin using legal categories to understand what it is that Christ's death on the cross does for us. And he begins arguing for what's known as forensic justification. He does it in terms of medieval law. Earlier, Tertullian in the 2nd century had done something similar in terms of Roman law. We do it in terms of modern law, but Anselm is going to set the trajectory for all of the Latin world's understanding of justification, where we see it in terms of a legal forgiveness of sin and all of that kind of thing. This is really going to get going with Anselm. From there, we get, as commercial society develops, as cathedrals are developing and all that kind of thing, the cathedrals can't really maintain the schools. They've got too many other things they've got to do. So a split off from the cathedral schools developed, frequently still sort of connected into the cathedrals, but it's actually new institutions are developed. And these are guilds of masters, that is to say teachers, guilds of masters and scholars. Now, one of the medieval words for a guild is universitas, from which we get the word university. People get the etymology of university wrong all the time. What it is a guild. But it's a guild of masters, that is to say teachers and students. And so universities begin developing. The earliest in 1150, roughly, in Bologna, Italy, was a law school. The next significant one around 1200 is the University of Paris. And it's going to focus around liberal arts, the topics that Alcuin had brought in under Charlemagne. It's going to focus on liberal arts. It will then develop advanced faculties in law, in various forms of law, in medicine, theology, and so on. And so you begin getting a whole new focus on education. There's a demand for credentials. You've got increasing bureaucracy, you've got administration, all of that. There's increasing demand for credentials, all of these things. And so the schools are there to supply these needs, okay? But they're also working heavily in developing theological ideas. How do we understand the universe? How do we understand our place in the universe? How do we understand what God is doing? So back in the day of the cathedral schools in the 12th century, a worldview emerged that is known as Platonic humanism. Basically, the core of Platonic humanism is the idea that the world comes from God. Therefore, you can study the world to lead you back to God. Because the world, as it was created, points to God. It is an outflow of his own thinking, his own ideas, his own being in a very real sense. So if you study the world, this can help you get back to understand God. Then, around the late 12th century, 13th century, scholars, now a lot of ancient writings were lost in the West. They were preserved in the Greek world. And many of them passed from the Greek world through Christian Syrian translators into the Muslim world, and from there had passed into Spain. Well, Christian scholars in Spain began encountering writings of this guy by the name of Aristotle. They had a little of his writing before, but suddenly they're finding a whole lot more there. And so they begin studying Aristotle and other ancient writers that they're beginning to get from Spain. They begin bringing these into Europe. And what you have in Aristotle is a complete worldview, in essence, a body of writings that really addresses every question medieval philosophers were asking. But the question is, we've already got this Platonic humanism worldview. How do we integrate Aristotle into this? So they develop a methodology of study called scholasticism. Note, scholasticism is a method of study, technically. It's not a kind of philosophy, it's not a kind of theology. You can use it in any field. You can use scholasticism to study rhetoric. You can use scholasticism to study law. I've actually read treatises where they use scholasticism to study witchcraft. I mean, you can use it for anything. It's a methodology. It consists of 6 parts, the last 2 of which can be repeated. The first is you ask a question. Okay. Second, you collect authorities. Okay, the medieval world believed that truth is found in the past. The reason they believed this, there are a number of factors here, but one of them is the idea, first of all, that absolute truth exists, which is questioned in our world. Second, that absolute truth is understandable, at least to some degree, by the human mind. Another thing that's questioned much more strongly in our world. Thirdly, truth is necessary for society, because any society that is not built on truth is built on a lie, and therefore it cannot stand. The corollary then is, therefore, the best way to find truth is find successful ancient societies. Look at the ones that succeeded, that did well, and look at what they had to say, because they must have known truth. So they're going to collect the authorities to answer their question. But when you do this, you'll start noticing that the authorities have varying answers. So you divide them into 2 categories, yes and no. Those who answer the question yes, those who answer the question no. Latin, sic et non, yes and no. So you divide the authorities there. Then, well, since truth is an absolute thing, these guys are all talking about truth. They can't really be contradicting each other. So how do you resolve the differences between them? And they develop very sophisticated logic, drawing from Aristotle and then developing it further. I was a linguistics major as an undergrad. They develop really sophisticated linguistic arguments that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 1960s. Okay, they're using really incredibly sophisticated linguistic theories and all this to find ways to resolve the questions. Then, step 3, okay, ask a question, collect your authorities, analyze them. Step 4, present your resolution. How do you resolve all these things? What's your answer to the question? Then step 5 and step 6 can repeat as often as necessary. Step 5, raise the strongest objection to this you can, and make the strongest argument against it you can. Step 6, answer that objection. And you keep repeating these. So that's the scholastic method. And it is really custom made to integrate Aristotle into the existing worldview of Platonic humanism. Now, they certainly do go overboard at a few places where Aristotle begins being more important than Scripture, but those are shut down, pretty quickly. So that's scholasticism, and it produces a tremendous amount of great work in the church. They do tremendously. I mean, Thomas Aquinas is still studied today. He's probably the ultimate example of this. So you have this huge burst of education. But at the same time, you have problems in the church, because the church is becoming increasingly wealthy and powerful. And there are a lot of people in the church who are reformers, who see the problems here. Your bishops are typically not people anymore who are in this because they are driven for spiritual purposes. They're mostly younger sons of nobles who get a job as a bishop because, well, it's an honorable thing to do, and it helps enhance family power because now you've got influence in other areas. These guys aren't really serious about the faith. They're also living high on the hog. It was law across Europe that everybody had to pay 10% of their income to the church. So you end up in situations where these people who are extremely impoverished are giving 10% of their income to bishops who are walking around in jeweled robes and eating off of golden plates. This generates a lot of resentment. And so there are a whole series of medieval reform movements that develop, many of them, frankly, heretical. You have, for example, the Albigensians, which is a resurrection via a whole chain of other groups of ancient Manichaeism, which is a form of hyper-Gnosticism. You have probably my favorite group, are the Petrobrusians. This was a group headed by a guy by the name of Peter of Bruy. And Peter objected to a whole lot of things in the church. He said, we should only pay attention to the Gospels. I doubt that the rest of the New Testament were really written by apostles, and the fact is the Old Testament is old. We don't watch it. It's only the Gospels. We shouldn't have church buildings. We shouldn't venerate the cross. We shouldn't have infant baptism. There's this whole series of things that he did. And he was a real firebrand, almost literally. In the end, literally. He used to make bonfires and urge people to throw their idolatrous stuff like their crucifixes in it. Until one day, the crowd got sufficiently annoyed at him that they picked him up and threw him in his own bonfire. I probably shouldn't tell you that because we're having a bonfire tonight, but there you have it. But there are others that are less extreme, but the thing that is driving all of them, with few exceptions, the thing that really drives them is the issue of wealth and poverty and the parallel issue of power versus weakness in the church. Should the church be wealthy and powerful, or should the church be poor and weak? The Pope says, I'm the vicar of Christ on earth. The church is the representative of the kingdom of God on earth. You don't send an ambassador in rags to another country. You send an ambassador to another country to show off the power, the glory, the wonders of that country. That's what you do. And the church should be doing that in this world. Therefore, the church must be wealthy and it must be powerful. On the other hand, you have people saying, excuse me? In Luke's gospel, Jesus said, blessed are the poor. He told the rich ruler to sell everything you have, give to the poor, and follow him. He said, foxes have dens and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He says, woe to you who are rich, in Luke. How do you make that work? So the reformers are looking at this both on the practical level, like particularly the Albigensians, the Waldensians, and others are upset about the poor giving to the rich in the name of Christ. So you've got that going on. You also, so you got that side of it, but you also have a theoretical thing here that, is this what the church really ought to be? Should the church really have bishops in jeweled cloaks, eating off gold plates, and all that sort of thing? Is that really what the church is about? So there's a tension. This is a tension that is going to exist there. But the reform movements in the Middle Ages really center on this. And along with that, we have a resurgent form of Donatism. Remember, Donatism, an unworthy priest is not a true priest. You get attacks on the clergy because a lot of them, remember, they're not really here because they're serious about their faith. They're here because they're the younger sons of nobles. So they have mistresses and things like that. And so you get a number of the reformers, Peter Waldo and others, who are going to be saying, no, the immorality of the clergy demonstrates that they're not true followers of Christ. These guys need to be deposed and you need to steer clear of them. So you have a kind of Donatism that comes up as well during the period. And these are going to be characteristics of these medieval reform movements. It turns out that in the long run, well, the Waldensians, the followers of Peter Waldo, still exist. There's still a Waldensian church. They're the only medieval, quote, heresy, according to the Catholic Church, that still exists. They're not heretical. Okay. But some of the movements are embraced by the Catholic Church, the Franciscans, for example. They will actually have this idea of apostolic poverty, that you shouldn't own anything, at least initially. They find ways to fudge around it later. So this is the real tension there. It turns out, though, in the long run, this isn't going to be the thing that is going to trigger a full-scale reform in the church. These things are popping up all over the place, and they have varying degrees of effect, varying degrees of acceptance. Many of them are condemned. Many people die because of this. But in the long run, this isn't going to be the thing that breaks it. What's going to really break the hold of the Catholic Church in Europe is a totally different question that's going to come from a very different direction. We'll talk about that in the next talk, because I think I'm out of time. So, thank you.
Questions?
I was curious about, you talked about Alcuin and Charlemagne. They had a bit of a disagreement with especially the East over, was it Nicaea II, the Seventh Ecumenical Council? Do you feel that that was warranted, that there weren't enough Western bishops there? Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, I don't. The real tension that showed up between Charlemagne and the East was actually over iconoclasm. And in the end, Charlemagne was supporting the position that the Orthodox Church will end up taking. I don't think the disagreement over the Seventh Council was really that significant.
Given the dispute over the filioque clause, and given that the language at Nicaea was without that clause, should we be using the filioque clause, or should we go and stick it with what was approved at the Council of Nicaea?
All right. Hang on tight.
We have a bonfire tonight, you know.
Next question. Okay. If you read the Gospel of John, Jesus says he's going to send the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father. So if you're using biblical language, Nicene in the original version is correct. Orthodox theologians today, at least some of them that are a little more open-minded, Orthodox theologians today will say, well, wait a minute. The version of the Nicene Creed you guys have is in Latin. The original is in Greek. If by proceeds you're trying to translate the original Greek word, you've got a problem. But it turns out that proceeds could translate a separate Greek word, and if in fact that's what you mean, there's really no problem aside from the fact that you changed the creed without an ecumenical council to do it. So theologically, the Orthodox world, at least some theologians in the Orthodox world, will accept proceeds from the Father and the Son as long as you understand proceeds as being one specific Greek word rather than another one, because you've got a problem of translation here. So proceeds from the Father through the Son has been proposed. There are a number of ways that you can do this. But it's clear, well, John says the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, but he also says, I'm going to send him. So what does proceed even mean? I mean, if you think about it. If Jesus is the one who's sending the Holy Spirit, can't you say that the Holy Spirit is proceeding from him too? You know, that's the way the reasoning goes. So there are some theologians in the Orthodox world that will accept that as theologically correct, but ecclesiastically wrong because it wasn't done by an ecumenical council.
In the back there, behind you, Corin.
Just for fun, can you elaborate on any Irish monk influence in North America?
Well, the one possibility is a guy by the name of Saint Brendan the Navigator. Brendan decided he was going to do his peregrinatio, apparently, by sailing west across the Atlantic in search of the promised land of the saints, which he identified with the ancient Celtic land of Tirnanog, which was the land of eternal youth in Celtic mythology, which existed somewhere to the west. Brendan put together a curragh, a kind of wood-framed, leather-hulled boat, hoisted a sail with a bunch of followers, and set off across the North Atlantic. He eventually made it back to Ireland, claiming that he'd found the promised land of the saints. Now, an adventurer by the name of Tim Severn back in the 1970s decided to try to recreate this to see if it was possible. So he set off across the North Atlantic with a bunch of other crazy guys in a wood-framed, leather-hulled boat. And now, when Brendan came back, there was a story called the Navigatio, the Voyage of St. Brendan. It was one of the most famous legends of the Middle Ages. And it's obviously heavily embroidered and things like that. There are all kinds of spiritual stuff added to it. But Severn wondered if it might have any actual connection to reality. So when he set out from Ireland, from the place that Brendan set off, he found what he believed to be what in the Navigatio is called the Island of Birds in the Faroe Islands. As far as the islands of floating crystal, those were pretty obviously icebergs. Brendan saw an island that was burning, quite possibly Iceland, the volcanic stuff. And Severn made it all the way to North America. I suspect that Brendan did make it to North America, quite possibly sailed south. I mean, can you imagine an Irish monk landing in the Caribbean? This is going to look like the promised land of the saints, I'm telling you. I think he probably at least hit North America, probably went south. How did he get back? The Gulf Stream. It turns out if you pick up the Gulf Stream, it will take you straight to Ireland. And so he actually completed the voyage. It took him a few years, but completed the voyage and came back to Ireland with the story. I suspect that's the case. Now, there are supposed examples of stones that have ancient Celtic writing on them and things like that in different places. I am somewhat skeptical because a lot of things like this have been proven to be forgeries. So I would like a lot more support for them before I put any weight on them. But Brendan, I think you got a good case for.
I have a question. Can you tell us about the Celtic cross?
Celtic cross. Yeah, I was hoping to have a blackboard or whiteboard or something like that so I could do this. But okay. In Ireland, when the Celts arrived in Ireland, there had been a people who had lived there earlier. That Stone Age people, they put up these standing stones. There are a lot of them around Ireland. There's a whole lot of them in Carnac and Brittany. They used to be all over Northern Europe. And when the Celts arrived, they saw these things. They didn't know what they were for, but they assumed that they were some sort of sacred sites. And they developed, being Irish, they developed all kinds of stories around them. There's this ring of stones with 9 of these stones together, and they were 9 maidens who were dancing, and when the sun came up, they got turned to stone. There are all kinds of legends like that. But they were clearly, excuse me, for the Celts, they were clearly holy sites. Now, when Christianity comes to Ireland, one of Brendan's associates, actually, a guy by the name of Columba, sailed to the island of Iona off Scotland, and from there, he and his followers will evangelize Scotland and down into England, Lindisfarne, down as far as York. That's why York is a Celtic foundation. It's from these people coming from Iona. But at Iona, they evidently decided, we've got these pagan standing stones. We should have Christian standing stones. So they carved a large stone cross. It's known as the St. John's Cross, what's left of it. What's left of it because it turns out that the stone was not structurally sound and the cross pieces broke and fell. But they still wanted these Christian standing stones. So what they decided to do was to make a stone where there was a support for the cross pieces, which was actually, they decided to use the form of a circle. Why did they do that? Well, if you take just the circle with a cross embedded in it, inside it, nothing extending outside the boundaries of the circle, just a cross with a plus sign in it. That is something anthropologists call the sun cross, because they say it's a symbol of the sun. The anthropologists who say this, it may be a symbol of the sun, but the anthropologists who say this haven't talked to enough people. It turns out that this was a symbol we know that was used all across Northern European paganism. It was used by the Celts, it was used by the Germans, it was used by the Slavs. And there are existing Slavic pagans who maintain the meaning of that symbol. And it turns out that what that symbol is it's sort of like an Indian mandala. It's a symbolic representation of the entire universe. Now, excuse me, I've got to turn my back to you because I'm going to be pointing in the wrong directions if I don't. Well, maybe I'll try it. But anyway, the top arc of it, this part is easy. The top arc represents the heavens. The lower arc represents the underworld. The horizontal line is Middle Earth. Yes, that's where Tolkien got the term. Why Middle Earth? Because it's in the middle between the heavens and the underworld. The vertical line is, in Norse mythology, it's called Yggdrasil. It's the world tree that ties all the different realms together. The roots of Yggdrasil are in the underworld. The branches are in the heavens. The branches in the heavens represent divine wisdom. The branches, the roots in the underworld represent ancestral wisdom. So it's the structure of the universe and it's the sources of wisdom and knowledge. But it's more than that. It's also let's use it as a compass. With the compass, south is on the top, north is on the bottom. Why that? Well, because you're in the northern hemisphere, you're in the far northern hemisphere, light comes from the south, okay? It's where the sun is. So the heavens, light, that's on top, the north is on the bottom. So then you have east to the left and west to the right. So it's a compass. But it's more than that, it's also a calendar. Spring, summer, fall, winter. It's a clock, dawn, noon, sunset, dusk, and midnight. It's also your life, birth, youth, maturity, old age. So this one symbol, this sun cross, is not just the sun. It's the structure of the universe. It's the sources of wisdom and knowledge. It is a compass. It is your days, your years, and your life. All of it is represented in this one symbol. So what do they do on Iona? They take the sun cross and they put over it the cross of Christ. What does this say? What does this communicate? What it says is that Jesus is Lord of space and time. He is the Logos, the one who enlightens every man. He is the source of all wisdom. He is the Lord of your days, your years, your life. He's the Lord of the universe. The thing that binds together heaven, the earth, and the underworld is the cross. The cross is Yggdrasil. The cross is the thing that ties the cosmos together. And Jesus rules over all of it from the cross. The cross represents Jesus' supreme authority over time and space. Jesus as the source of all wisdom, all knowledge. Jesus' triumph over the pagan world that only saw the sun cross and didn't see the whole thing. Jesus rules over all of this. He's Lord of all. That's what the Celtic cross means. And very, very few people actually know this. The only reason why I worked it out is I happened to read a book that was given to me about Slavic paganism. So when you see those Celtic crosses on Presbyterian churches and Anglican churches and so on, that's what you should be thinking of.